Today's lecture talks about a specific kind of plant. These are herbaceous plants, and they're basically plants that look a lot like grasses. And so they actually get this name graminoid, and that oid ending kind of tells us that we've got something that looks like something else. So as we'll see, something grainy or grassy is gramineous, graminia. So graminoid is like a grass. So you're probably familiar with plants of the grass family, and we'll certainly focus on those. But these are also some other families that are closely related too. So they're easily confused for grasses and also close relatives. So this is a whole big group of plants that are kind of conformed or converged, or I should say inherited this ancestral feature of being grassy. So they've been very successful worldwide, as we will see, and that's because of some of the features that they have going for them. There are parts of the world that are characterized as grasslands. So you might notice that we've got some of these grasslands sort of adjacent to areas that we identified previously as being deserts. So for example, a lot of Australia counts as a desert, and beyond that, adjacent to the desert part of these grassland areas, the Western United States, we've got the mountains contributing to some deserty habitat in these areas, and not too far from the high western desert of North America is this big grassland of North America, and so on. Graminoids, grasses in particular, are occupying a part of the world that is also really good for agriculture. So a lot of the plants that we farm are actually plants of the grass family. So wheat and corn are grasses, and they tend to do well in these grassy environments. So you're also looking at parts of the world that might be a little better suited for growing grains. So these have their own environmental conditions that cause the plants to thrive here. They tend to be a little bit on the drier side, and then also prone to things like fire and winds that can keep taller plants away. So this is a widespread herbaceous habitat, these grassland habitats. I should mention on here, I've also highlighted some other features. So grasslands are dominated by grasses. Savannas are grasslands that also have trees, sparse trees, and then shrublands are more abundant woody vegetation that's just shorter. So mostly grasses, we'll say. So what makes a graminoid? Graminoids, what I'm illustrating on this slide, these are all members of the grass family proper, and we'll highlight the differences between the grass family and its close relatives. But these are some features that would make a plant graminoid, so either a true grass or something similar. And one of the big things that stands out probably immediately to you is these long, linear, parallel veined leaves. This is kind of a hallmark of being a grass or graminoid. These are terrestrial plants, again, often in drier habitats, but we also have grasses in wet habitats. And these linear features, so slender stems, slender leaves, and really reduced flowers. So on here, I don't know that I could show you an individual flower that makes sense based on what we've described as the form of a flower, but we'll look at how the flowers are highly modified in this group, often for the purpose of wind pollination. And I have on here this little bit about having a dedicated inflorescence stalk. So sometimes the whole plant seems to be devoted to reaching the peak, the apex, and producing this reproductive structure. Sometimes you've got leaves more around the base, and then the reproductive structures on separate stalks. Sometimes you find that. All right, so when we have grasses, I mentioned they grow in particular parts of the world, sometimes prone to fire. So a big advantage of being a graminoid, and I guess this goes for a lot of herbaceous plants, but graminoids do pretty well at it, is they've got their roots below the ground level. That's nothing too surprising, but they tend to have, I'd say, a little more kind of expendable leaf material above ground. So a lot of times the dry older leaves, they just die in place and kind of clump up around the base of this plant. There becomes a lot of fuel in this area. So it's just like ready to catch on fire. And for the most part, these plants are kind of okay with that. So one of the management strategies for a grassland habitat is actually for humans to intentionally set a fire there. The fire comes through and destroys most of the above ground portion, and the part of the plant that's going to come back is at the ground level. So a little bit different from what we've talked about with herbaceous plants. These are herbaceous plants that kind of retain a lot of their growing potential at the ground level. So they might have buds here that are able to regenerate tissue after the fire. Might be that apart from the reproductive structure, all their leaves are coming out next to the base. So they're kind of able here to come back from the base without being at risk of losing their tissue to a fire, these important growing tip tissues. Really generalized terms here, but this is, I think, kind of illustrated by this image here where the fire is sweeping through rather rapidly. So this is not unheard of for a prairie fire to go rather quickly. And here's the lead of the fire, ready to burn up all this fresh fuel that's just dry leaves. Another parallel kind of strategy is that these plants can also be at risk of being chewed away from the above ground portion. So same thing if you've got grazing herbivores that are grazing on your grasslands, they also basically take away that above ground portion through grazing. And if you've got, again, your secure tissues at or below the ground level, that means you can grow back after being grazed in this fashion. So these grassland habitats historically and prehistorically are highly influenced by things like fires, these big grassland herbivores. So in North America, the herds of bison, Africa has got plenty of herbivores that sweep through and eat their graminoids as those grow up. So just a whole habitat that's really characterized by the presence of grasses and attracts a lot of other species there as well. Okay, so I mentioned these are closely related groups. They fall into this order called Poales. As we will see, the grass family is called Poaceae. So Poales named for grasses specifically, but we'll see these three big groups of graminoids that fall into the graminoid group. Also, groups we're not going to talk about in this context include the cattails and the burr-reeds in this family Typhaceae. This is in the family, or sorry, in the order Poales, but in that family Typhaceae, they also have a very graminoid kind of habit, these long linear leaves, inconspicuous individual flowers. One you might not think to place in this group is the pineapple family, which is called Bromeliaceae. We'll talk about that on its own later as well, or the so-called bromeliads, and those are also in Poales. But for the most part, when you think about this order, you're going to be thinking about these grassy types of plants. So long linear structures, skinny structures, and then flowers that are rather inconspicuous. So to start us off, we've got this family called Juncaceae. There's a widespread genus called Juncus that's illustrated in most of our illustrations. And Juncus stands the best chance of having flowers you'd recognize as flowers. We'll see that in a little bit. So I've got some features on all these. I'll try to give you kind of a parallel treatment of the different graminoid groups. So in Juncaceae, we've got vegetative features of round stems that are solid. So here's the stem portion, and this is a leaf heading off to the side. This is actually kind of a cylindrical leaf, which you sometimes get. Describe the leaves as basal, but of course, here's one coming off the stem. So we'll say maybe mostly basal. And then this sheathing leaf base, this is something that's we'll talk about in the graminoids. I'll illustrate it for you here. You can have a sheath on your leaf base where the blade comes away from the stem. I'll kind of exaggerate, oops, that portion. Okay, so if you've got a leaf, blade, sheath, the sheathing part is the blade technically is wrapped around the stem for, in some cases, quite a long ways. So this sheath, as we'll see in these different graminoid groups, may be closed or open, but it belongs to the same leaf and the leaf actually attaches at the base of that sheath. So you can have what looks like the blade coming away from the stem here, but it's actually originating here, circling the stem for a long time, and then going out as a blade on its own. So sheath plus blade, a little bit different from what we've talked about with petioles and stipules and so on. We haven't really talked about sheathing leaf bases yet. And that's pretty common for the graminoids. This provides a certain amount of protection. So as these leaves are being formed, they're encircling the growing part of the plant, and then eventually that emerges out as its own part of the stem and growth continues upwards. All right, so you can see by pulling this away that this sheath has come away from the stem in this location, and sometimes you see this sheathing structure, sometimes not. Another structure of note that's really well illustrated here is called a ligule. Oops. And this is, sorry, I keep touching my pad here. Bring it back, there we go. This structure is also part of the leaf. It's a little bit like a stipule, but in the graminoids, we call it a ligule. It just sort of sticks to the stem a little bit, and then as tissues get older, it might shrivel and kind of fall away a little bit. Ligule is reminiscent of the word tongue, is where that comes from. So it's like a little tongue piece, and it's coming out of the leaf at the location where the blade meets the sheath. So this isn't an axil. You'll notice that the stem is still quite intact in this location. The leaf doesn't attach until farther down out of this image, and that's all this sheath. So it's not the at the axil, it's at the location where the sheath separates from the blade. All right, still with us? Great. Okay, so I mentioned these are flowers that look more like flowers, and some really, I don't know, the more I see these, they're really just pretty flowers. Of course, I'm grabbing some of the better images I can find online, but really impressive little teeny tiny flowers, and illustrating nicely that we've got one of these monocot groups. So Poales is an order in the monocots clade, and as a monocot, we'd expect these parallel leaf venation that we've seen already. And then also perianth parts in multiples of 3. And sure enough, we have, as you can see in the floral formula, 6 tepals are characteristic of this family. These are rather stiff and bracty, or I shouldn't say bracty, they are tepals as such. Tepals that are kind of stiff, heading off in all directions in radially symmetrical flowers. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 stamens here, doing a kind of coily thing there, and then unified gynecium. So this is going to be a little bit different from what we see in the others, where we've got this gynecium with a carpel, or sorry, an ovary that's going to go on to become a capsule in a different format than we see in the other graminoids. So nice clean floral formula. If you get these, you still need some high power magnification to really appreciate them. But once you get them magnified, you see you've got parts you can recognize. I can recognize the tepals and the stamens and the pistil in the middle there. Not too confusing. The other ones will need a separate diagram and different terminology. So as I mentioned there, the ovary becomes a dry dehiscent capsule. And so the fruit type is capsule. The capsules have lots of seeds inside. You can kind of just see that they've got a little bit more of a capsule format. There's a little leftover of the style at the tip of this, and then some seams where this can break apart. So I got these images showing the broken apart, ruptured portions of the dry fruit there. Really nice images here. I've got a link to the source. Mostly in Juncaceae, we've got plants in the genus Juncus, and that's almost everything I have illustrated on this lecture. Another genus is called wood rush, Luzula. So rush there is the common name for plants in Juncaceae. Really not a lot of exciting common names in this group either, so rush. Moving on to our next graminoid group, this is called Cyperaceae, and their common name are sedges. So we'll contrast a few of the things that we talked about for Juncaceae with the vegetative features of Cyperaceae. So one of the features to note is that we often have these triangular stems. So we saw in Juncaceae, they had rounded stems. Cyperaceae have triangular stems, and then there's a little caveat there. The triangular if the stems are leafy. So we have some members of this group that have leaves only coming from the base. And in that case, they can have round stems, but if they have leaves coming out along the stem, then the leaves are 3-ranked and the stem is triangular. So those two things go together. What do I mean when I say 3-ranked? It's basically if you look down this plant from the top, we could even start in by drawing that triangular stem. If you look down, you would see the leaves coming out in 3 angles. And some of these plants show this a little bit better than others. So I'll draw some overlapping layers, maybe to give you the impression. So if you look down on a leafy stem of a sedge plant, you might see something like this, where there are leaves heading out in 1 of 3 directions, very symmetrical pattern. And then of course that stem would have the triangular features. So these go together, the flat face where the leaves emerge in three different directions. All right, as far as sheaths, we have closed sheaths. So drew you the sheath before, and sometimes those sheaths, if you peel them away, go back up to the drawing I just did. Sometimes if you peel the leaf away, the sheath will come apart. So it's open on one side, it's just overlapping. In other cases, the sheath is fused on the far side and it's just a complete circle all the way around the stem. And that's more what we have with Cyperaceae here, the sedge family. So closed sheaths, usually missing that ligule that I illustrated for you before. Inflorescence structure. So these are individual flowers that don't look so much like flowers anymore. So we have these graminoids that are almost always wind pollinated. So wind pollinated flowers tend to be really inconspicuous. They don't look like much on their own. They don't look like a normal flower, even with any kind of symmetry. And you have to really know what you're looking at to be able to piece together what parts of reproduction you're looking at. So we'll get into the individual flowers in a second, but before we get there, I want to point out that the flowers are organized into structures called spikelets. And we're going to see this term spikelet in the sedge family and also in the grass family. And it's sometimes hard to pin down exactly what a spikelet is. The definition in the sedge family is basically one of these repeating structures. So this thing looks like that thing, looks like that thing. So these 3 units are spikelets, and each one of them has these rounded structures of the ovaries becoming fruits. And you can see how they're kind of repeats of the same kind of structure, and they're joined together one at a time along this reproductive axis. So each of these is a spikelet. Each of these 3 things is a spikelet in this case. So a lot different format, but still lots of flowers, in this case hanging down, so they're pendant. Here's another one where they're kind of flattened against each other in 2 dimensions. So they're going off to one side or the other. But each one of those kind of corncob looking things, that's a spikelet. Here we've got a nice pine cone kind of shape. So spiral arrangement, this is a spikelet. So it really depends on the kind of sedge you're looking at, but somewhere in there will be one of these repeating structures of spikelet. So I guess it'll make sense as you get more practice. Okay, the individual flowers, very small and reduced because of wind pollination and reduced down to not much in the way of perianth. And there's actually a pretty big contribution of this bract. So we saw the term bract before. Bract is a leaf that's associated with the inflorescence, and the bract subtends a flower. So what that means is that the bract is a specialized leaf, and in the axil of that leaf, that's where the flower is located. So serves as a nice bit of protection during development and beyond, as that delicate flower is developing. It's protected by the developing bract, also sealed up from animals that might want to chew on the flowers or the developing fruits. So sometimes you'll see in the inflorescence, like here's a nice example of a lot of overlapping bracts that are kind of protecting the flowers. Over here, this darker color, these are the bracts associated with the, in this case, the fruits have gotten quite big. So they're beyond maybe needing protection. Okay, but anyway, the bract is helpful for kind of orienting yourself to a flower. The individual flowers, as you can see, they have perianth of 0 to 6 tepals. The tepals are really reduced, so they're reduced into these bristles. So sometimes you see them, they're symmetrically arranged around the fruit or the flower, but those are actually remnants of or descended from the ancestral perianth. So 6 in this case. The stamens, of course, in a wind-pollinated plant, stamens are prominent. They've got really big anthers on here, as I've got illustrated on the right. So they're good at dispersing a lot of pollen. They're, as we see, 3 to 6 stamens. The gynecium, 2 to 3 carpels fused together in a superior ovary. And this business in here, this white, feathery kind of stuff, these are the stigmas all kind of lumping all around each other. Big stigmas, feathery stigmas, these are adaptations we see often in wind-pollinated plants, so good at catching pollen out of the air. And then already scooting ahead to the fruit in the center, we have a fruit developing. This is an achene. So fortunately in our graminoid groups, the fruit type is nice and distinctive. So we had capsules in Juncaceae, now we've got achenes in Cyperaceae, and then sometimes, as I say, with this little beak on top here, depends on the group. And then there's one genus of note. This is an enormous genus, especially in Wisconsin. We have lots and lots of plants of this genus called Carex, and deserves its own mention because it has this totally enclosed covering around the flower here. So it's surrounding and protecting the ovary there, and you can kind of see a little two-parter telling you where the stigmas were emerging from there. But this covering here, this is distinctive of this group, Carex, and it's got a special name, periginium. The GYN, that's the female portion. So around the gynecium, periginium, Carex. And actually a lot of what I've shown you already for the inflorescence, here is Carex, there's a Carex, and so on. All right, economically, there's some plants that are noteworthy in this group. Ecologically, they're quite important, especially for wetlands, members of Cyperaceae. Economically, the plant called Cyperus papyrus has a common name of papyrus, and that name papyrus goes back to ancient Egypt, and this was the inspiration for paper. So one of the main inventions of paper was to take the pith out of the stems of this plant, pound it flat, and weave those together, and that got you paper. So big important step forward in human innovation, thanks to papyrus. Another one you might be familiar with is the water chestnut. Has a corm, so this big starchy stem base, sometimes features in Asian cuisine. And this is a sedge in the genus called Eleocharis. Locally, we've got, as I said, lots of members of Carex. Here's one with not too many flowers at a time, very small star-like spikelets. Cotton grass, what do we got here? Cotton sedge, I should say. Scirpus, so lots of variations on sedge, spike sedge, cotton sedge. Some of these have rush in their common name. I think some people might be trying to take us away from that because rush, of course, reminds you of juncus. This is one reason that common names are not always helpful. Bulrushes, Chenoplectus, Scirpus, and so on. And this is a book only devoted to the genus Carex, kind of an indicator of how big that genus is in Wisconsin. All right, third graminoid group, for the namesake of the graminoids, is Poaceae. And this is our first case where we get a family that has an alternative name. So there's this formulaic name that we've seen is based on a genus name. And that's where Poaceae comes from. So there's a genus called Poa. In fact, our bluegrass that you have in your lawn is the genus Poa. And so that gives you the name Poaceae. And there's this other name that basically, because it's been in use for so long, because it was being used at the time when these names were coming into fashion, it's just been used so widely that it's not worth forcing people to undo that name. Some people are just stuck in it. Even 300 years later, people are using this name. There's no official word on which one of these is better. So I don't want to sound like I'm against one of these or the other. They're equivalent names, and you might see either of them in publication. But this one obviously doesn't follow the official ending. So this is not based on a genus name. There's no genus Graminia. There might be, I'm not aware of the one that there is. This is like from an old Latin term meaning just like the grains. So sometimes the grass family, as I call it, some people call it the grain family. We'll see this has a lot of economically important grains in it. So it's a group that people have been referring to by that name. So as you learn it, you can choose to learn either one. Probably if you do this professionally, you'll want to learn both of those. So Poaceae or Graminii, either one of those. As I say here, extremely widespread. So as we saw before, the sedges and actually to a great degree, the rushes are kind of wetland plants. And when we talk about grassland, we're largely talking about areas dominated by Poaceae. So not just Graminoids, but actually in this family Poaceae, extremely widespread. So grasslands and savannas have grasses in them. Vegetatively, they have round stems that are hollow. So we saw in Juncaceae, those were solid stems. Leaves are 2-ranked, so contrasting to what we saw with Cyperaceae that were 3-ranked, this is a case of being 2-ranked. So if you look down the stem of these plants, you'll see the leaves come out one side and then the other side and so on. And really nice, you can flatten them onto a sheet to press them if you need to. Open sheaths, so this nice illustration here shows the ligule and then shows this being pulled away. And if you pull this away and you don't have to tear anything, then that means that it wasn't actually fused on the far side of the leaf. It was just wrapped around the stem. So serves very much the same function of protecting the stem or holding onto the stem, but it's just not fused. So developmentally, a little bit different feature that we can use to identify this family. One of the interesting defenses of plants in the grass family, they don't typically have a lot in the way of toxins. So one of the reasons they're a good choice for people to cultivate these different grasses that people eat, they're not toxic, they don't produce poisonous chemicals or anything like that. Their main defense, apart from just being able to grow back after being eaten, they have a defense by being able to put this glass into their tissues. So silica is basically the same thing as glass, and they enrich for silica and they kind of crystallize it on their plant body. And this makes it so that whoever's chewing on them has to chew through this glass structure, makes them more resistant to especially small herbivores like insects, but also wears down the teeth of larger herbivores. So I found some nice images here from publication that highlight where these silica cells and silica granules and so on are put together in the plant. So it's, I'd say, worth knowing about that part of their defense. Their flowers are even more complicated. So another step up from the complexity of Cyperaceae. Now we're looking at spikelets and individual flowers again. The grass family spikelet has a little bit different definition. You define a spikelet in Poaceae by the presence of these bracts called glooms. So there are 2 glooms. They're alternate but offset from each other. So I don't want to say that they're opposite because they're alternate, but they're close to each other. And they don't have any flowers in their axils. So that would separate them from one of these other more bracty structures. And so wherever those are, that defines the base of a spikelet. You can have 1 flower in a spikelet, you can have many flowers. This term floret often gets used for these really tiny flowers, like I've illustrated here. And so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 florets inside of this spikelet. And again, this would be a repeating structure that you see in across the individual plants and then also in different members of the same species. So spikelet, the individual flowers, we saw in Cyperaceae that a bract was important to subtending that flower. In Poaceae, there are actually 2 of these bracts that work together to make this really well enclosed, like a crab's claw sealed up compartment. The 2 bracts, and they're called the lemma and the palea. And I'm afraid there's just sometimes no getting around these terms. I think these are helpful terms, but new terms nonetheless. So let me try to illustrate this here. There are 2 bracts associated with an individual flower or floret, and they're offset just a little bit. So there's a lower one and an upper one. And the lower one, we can use L for lower, and actually going to use P for upper. The lower one's called lemma. So L for lower, and the upper one, we're going to use P for upper, and this one's called the palea. So it's a little off maybe, but it helps me to remember the lemma for lower and the palea for upper. And that's how they're, so if you're looking through a key and you need to determine which one is which, can be important. Sometimes you've got one of these with a big extra growth on it called an on, as in this illustration here. So on, not always present, but sometimes present, and I'd say more often found in the lemma, this lower bract. The flower itself is quite a bit like what we saw with Cyperaceae, so not, doesn't have those bristles, but it does have these structures called loticules, which are kind of interesting. So they're descended from an ancestral perianth, but now they're just these two little nubs, and they actually have a function in pushing apart. They swell to push open these two bracts to enable reproduction to happen. Then we got what we've seen before, these dangly, large anthered stamens, and then the big feathery stigmas present here. So 2 to 3 perianth parts, those loticules, 2 to 3 stamens, 2 to 3 fused carpels in a superior ovary. And as we've seen before, lots of wind pollination. So if you catch your grass plants flowering, first off, I'm sorry for your allergies. These are a big source of allergy for me. When you have allergies at a certain time of year, sometimes it's grass pollen. So we've got male flowers releasing clouds of pollen, and then female flowers with their big feathery stigmas to capture the pollen. Fruit type is distinctive in the grass family. So it does have this name grain. So you would be correct in saying technically that the fruit type is a grain. If you want to be a little more technical and specific, you can call it a caryopsis. What it is a dry indehiscent fruit, and it's different from an achene because the seed is fused to the fruit wall. So this shows this is endosperm, which belongs to the seed, and this is pericarp, which belongs to the fruit, and they're just stuck together all throughout. So you can differentiate the cell types, but you wouldn't be able to peel them apart or anything like that. This is actually a corn kernel. So when you're eating corn, you're eating a little fruit every time you get a corn kernel. And as you're probably familiar, it's hard to take the edge, the top waxy part off of a corn kernel. That's just fused to the starchy stuff on the inside. So major family of economic importance for the world, also ecological importance, as we saw. Plants in the grass family are grains, and they supply, as it says here, a whole bunch of calories for humans. So people have diets that are anchored by rice in some parts of the world, by corn in some parts of the world, by wheat. So depends a little bit in parts of the world where you live, but these are really just have followed the human species around as we've conquered the world. And whatever people were living in an area kind of took over their local grasses to eat. So rice, wheat, corn, rye, oats, barley, millet, just big starch balls that are really good for sustaining human energy. And then in North America, our big one is corn. So corn or maize. And this little illustration here, I'm in everything. It's kind of true. There's the corn that we eat, and then there are a whole bunch of corn products that end up in other foods that we want. So for everything from soaps to plastics can be made from corn. There's a lot of corn around. Other ones of note, bamboo is a grass, kind of this giant tree-like grass. Crabgrass, a weedy plant, you might find in your lawn. Bluegrass, one you might be intending to put in your lawn. And then lots of them locally, lots of diversity, quite challenging even for seasoned botanists, I'd say, to get to know all these different grass family groups, but worth spending the time on, I'd say, if you can. And a couple of invasive plants in the grass family as well. Phragmites is a notorious plant. You see this really tall grass on roadsides. And then another one that's just almost ubiquitous in wetlands, this reed canary grass. It's pretty problematic.